Listen to the All in My Head podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, and wherever you get your podcasts.
Please, allow me to show you something.
Hello, world, and welcome to the very first episode of the All in My Head podcast. I'm Jenny Jimenez-Sullivan, and I will be your host for all things happening in my head. Today's episode is called When in Doubt, Write It Out, and it will cover my initial exposure to writing, journaling, and my influences in the area of writing that I've had along the way. But I wanted to start with a little bit of background as to how the All in My Head podcast came to be. This has been a brainchild of mine for probably over 5 or 6 years, and it is basically because of the way I was raised. So back in the 70s and 80s, in the era of being seen and not heard, and being told to keep your feelings in, that we don't tell other people our business. And in the Latino community, it is said, y te quedes callada. And that really means to stay quiet, to make yourself small, and be a proper girl. Don't make too much noise, and don't portray yourself as an outgoing girl in any way. And for myself, as an introverted extrovert and a highly empathetic person, I was really unaware of how to navigate those feelings. And I kept my emotions bottled up and had most of my conversations in my head a million times before I ever even thought about having a conversation out loud with somebody. And 9 times out of 10, I actually never had those conversations with someone. I was way too scared to do so. And a huge part of starting this podcast is so that I stop living in my head and I can be unapologetically myself. I've information and have said that to my children and to students I've had in the past 100,000 times, to be yourself, to own your thoughts and your eccentricities and your gifts and your talents. And I wanted to start doing that for myself. I wanted to have conversations that are important and that matter, and just honestly share myself wholeheartedly and uncensored, and take the filter that family and society placed on myself and so many other people in the world who are just like me. So going back, I started writing in a diary format when I was maybe 10 or 11, and it may have been younger than that. I recall kind of writing just my thoughts, maybe making them a little sing-songy or poetic. And later on, I learned more about writing as my schooling went along. And I found myself to be more interested in writing as my teenage years came to be, the angsty teenager. And I really wanted an outlet and needed an outlet, because living in your head is very exhausting, and not being able to share things that I was passionate about or things that I felt like other people would want to hear was draining, and I needed that outlet. And I would say that really the first time I was awakened to writing in a more visual and artistic and hands-on way was in middle school. I always loved reading. I always loved having a book with me wherever I went, and that was an escape for me to be able to get into the characters that were kind of popping out of the book. But in the manner of being able to write it and see poetry and writing as a form of expressing yourself and in a more solidified way wasn't until my middle school years. And I distinctly remember my teacher at St. Francis. I went to a Catholic school in Connecticut, in New Britain, Connecticut, to be exact. And that obviously was run by nuns and priests. But we had this amazing English teacher, and her name was Mrs. Sager. She really stepped out of the box of teaching English in just the regular format of the 80s and the concrete vocabulary and basic grammar and, English straight out of the book. And I remember, and again, growing up in Connecticut, there was many a snowy day that we went to school. We didn't get days off to be home and hang out as often as we see that happening now, or even when my kids grew up in the 90s and 2000s. We would be in school and it would very well be snowing. And I remember her introducing us to Robert Frost. And that was the first time I had even heard of Robert Frost. I remember her pulling out a book of poetry and talking about one of her favorite poets. And she introduced us to the Robert Frost poem, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. And that was the first poem that I ever learned to memorize. And the visual of the snow falling outside the window probably ingrained that in my brain forever and was kind of the perfect scenario and setting for it. But hearing her read Frost's Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening is something I'm never going to forget, because it really opened my world to poetry and to visualization of words, and really made me fall in love with words more visually and in an auditory way. And I figured I'd read that for you. Now, it's definitely not going to sound like how she made it sound to me. I don't know, maybe I've made it into a fantasy of how she made it sound for me, but also it really was the first time I heard someone read something in a way that you knew they loved it. So here we go. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And I just loved that. I loved hearing those words and looking out the window at the winterscape and visualizing these horses trotting through the snow. And it really made me feel like I could do that. Like I could write and I could express myself in a completely different way, and that I could possibly have people fall in love with the words that I would say. And it was wonderful because, there's a lot of challenges growing up in the Catholic faith. There were very much so then, and probably still are. And there were also beautiful aspects of it. And I remember the challenges of being a Puerto Rican girl in a Catholic school that was predominantly white and where nobody really looked like me or sounded like me. And discipline was a huge thing back then in Catholic school. A nun or teacher could discipline you, and that was fine with your parents. They knew that you were being taken care of and disciplined if they weren't around, and that was okay, which is mortifying to me now, but it was the norm back then. And I had cheerleading as an outlet then, and that was really wonderful for me. But now I was able to see myself in a different way. And I was able to see that when poetry or a writing segment of English came about, it lit me up inside and it made me feel alive in a different way than I could ever imagine. And I loved it. And I would truly say that that was my journey beginning as a writer, although, as we'll talk about in future episodes, not all episodes will be about writing. They'll be about a host of things, but we will talk more about writing in future episodes and talk about how that kind of became a thing of shame for me and why it became something that I did secretly and didn't really share with people until I was grown, really. And now in my 50s, I'm doing a podcast and I'm writing more, and I'm in a journey that is exciting to me and makes me feel more at home in my body. But again, back then, it was kind of a thing of shame for me. And I felt comfortable when I was in school or in Miss Agrave's class talking about writing and being seen in a different way. And then I remember going into high school where we had this pretty eccentric and looking back, pretty awesome teacher named Mr. Cobesa. And now I'm in high school at another predominantly white high school in town, St. Thomas Aquinas. And Mr. Cobesa, who was a highly educated Yale grad, he was a writer, a huge political activist and anti-war activist. And, you know, he taught our English courses, and he also had this love of words and introduced us to Shakespeare and Keats and a lot of other beautiful, beautiful poets and things that I wasn't exposed to before. And interestingly enough, Mr. Cobesa would quite often miss school. He was doing these anti-war protests, and he was very involved in the community and being a figure who spoke out against these things and would sit in and would do all the things. But in typical Catholic school format, it was very secretive, so they thought. And whenever he would miss school, I was always bummed, first of all, because you knew that if there was a substitute, you weren't going to get that amazing, heartfelt, hands-on experience of the English language that you would get with Mr. Cobesa. But also, we just wanted to hear the truth. So we would hear stories that he was sick or that he had appointment or whatever they came up with at that time. But really, he was arrested because he was this very active activist who was going to go the full rounds with his beliefs, and he didn't care if he was arrested in the process. And that was something that I also felt very deeply, like his conviction for things was apparent, and he would touch on them when he would come back, but he kind of wasn't really allowed to talk or elaborate on it more, but you could feel his conviction. And that's how I felt when he talked about poetry. And I remember him saying to me when I wrote something before is he told me that I could be very good at it, and that if I took it seriously and that I didn't just use it as a means to get a grade or a means to an end, that I could do big things. And that was huge for me to hear as a 13, 14, 15-year-old at that time in early to mid 80s. That was important to hear that I could do big things. And I think he always challenged us to think outside the box, to look at our landscape, whether it was political or current events, and to talk about those things and to explore how it made us feel, and to write about it, not only write for ourselves, but also write and make a difference, which he did. He used that passion to make differences in the community, whether it be locally or on a global scale. And he definitely shared that passion with me and helped me see that there's other things that could inspire me. So for me, writing became a tool. It became a way for me to channel my feelings, to deal with emotions, to express my thoughts, and to get it out of my head and not to let it live in my head rent-free without explanation or without a voice. You know, words can live in our head, but they don't really give a voice to anxiety or to passion or to challenges or to joys. So I spent most all of my life secretly writing. And I have a million journals. My kids could tell you, my husband could tell you that I have bins full in the garage and tons on my bookshelf and at least 10 on my desk at all times. And I've always used a journal to balance my emotions, I guess is what you would say, or just in reflecting. And so I have poetry journals. I have journals that have full stories, full books written in them. I have written and started writing quite a few books on different subjects. And there really isn't anything to me that's off limits to write about. And I think that that has helped me channel some very difficult things that I have dealt with in my life, some losses, some issues surrounding familial challenges, issues with illness and death and grief and love and friendship and the sun and the ocean and all the things. I can always find something to write about. And it is very rare that I am at a loss for words. And my family can vouch to that as well. But I have found that for me, writing is not only a safe space, but it has saved me many times in my life when I have been dealing with something that has been difficult. And it has saved me, and it has helped me keep my sanity, and it has helped me find the sunshine in the darkest of days. And for me, that is everything. For me, writing is everything. And I think that I now know more than ever that that's something that I always want to be doing, and that I want to take it to different levels, and that I have a voice, and that people would probably like to hear what I have to say. And that is comforting to me. It is comforting to know for me that if I can't do anything else, I can sit down and I can open up a journal and I can write. And I can write something beautiful, and I can write something sad, and I can write something funny, and I can write something that challenges the mind, and that it can relate to someone. And it really can relate to anyone. And that's really what I have wanted to do with this podcast. I feel like there are so many things to talk about, and that we as a people, but really as women in general, are taught to kind of hold it all down, keep it inside, keep it together. But sometimes we're losing our shit, and that's okay. And I know for me that writing has been that saving grace. So that's kind of what I just wanted to touch on this first episode. Who I'm about, where I've come from a little bit, and touching on writing as a tool and an outlet and a way to channel the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I leave you with the thought or the question, maybe what helps you work through your emotions, your thoughts? What can be a tool to you for helping you through difficult times, but also helping you showcase the beautiful things that happen in life? What is something that you know you will always have in your life and that you will always need to help you on this journey, on this lifelong journey of growth, of sadness, of happiness, and share that with me. I would love to hear more about it. And I hope that we can talk more about it in future episodes of the All in My Head podcast, and that you will join me as we move forward and talk about everything under the sun. So thanks for dropping in to share your time with me. It honestly means the world to me. And I hope you will listen to this episode, share this episode, and have a bigger conversation about the things you hold dear. And I hope you will join me again for the All in My Head podcast. Thanks.